Hello. Wow. Are we started? Got caught off guard there. Looks like I pushed let's go while I was carrying my iPad out here. So I get to say hi a little bit different than normal. I see you, Gail. Hey, I hope things are going well. Rick, good to see you. That's so funny. Somebody who's going to tune into this Facebook Live is going to see probably the ceiling for a while at the front end, because I must have tapped start while I was carrying it out here. That's so funny. So we're gonna start in a couple minutes here. Let's see, get my phone timer so that I can see what time it actually is. And I thought that one of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit about whether or not this is helpful for people. It is helpful for me. Right now I have a plan to continue to do Mental Health Mondays through August and through September, so just in a little bit of time I'll mention some of the topics there. But if you guys are watching this later or even now, and it's helpful for you, then it's helpful for me to know that. And so either with the comments or sharing or liking, that's helpful for me, because that's some of the data that I get as to whether or not this is something worthwhile to continue offering. So I hope everybody is doing really great. Today we're going to look at a topic that is too big for our time, and so we actually may have a little bit, it may, instead of fitting in 10 or 15 minutes, it may be 15 or 20 minutes. I'll just kind of see how that goes. And so we're officially at 9 a.m. now, so we're going to move through a couple things. Let me get a sip of coffee. So welcome, and my name is Steve Reed. I'm pastor at H2O in Orlando, and I also am a mental health counselor in Orlando. And so this is an offering, Mental Health Monday is an offering mostly for us to take bite-sized pieces of mental health, emotional health, and spiritual health topics and issues, so that we can grow in awareness. As we grow in awareness, there's opportunity for movement of different kinds, and some of those pieces of movement can lead to freedom. And it is for freedom that Christ set us free. So our goal is to understand enough that we can find pathways towards freedom and experience what the Lord has invited us into. So July is for freedom. In July we have looked at freedom from intrusive thoughts, freedom from automatic negative thoughts, freedom from trauma, and today we're looking at freedom from addiction. And so in just a little bit we'll dive into that. August, next month, August is for angst. Angst is a very interesting thing. Angst is not the same as anxiety. Angst is that sense of anxiety mixed with hope. Will this get better? When will this get better? Many of us are dealing with anxiety, but many of us are actually dealing with angst as we are wrestling through COVID pieces. I hope this is going to get better. I think this is going to get better. When will it get better? It's not better yet. And so all of those things put a complex set of a mix of emotions going on inside. And when we think about angst, it is challenging to navigate those if we don't understand it well. So August is going to be about angst. September is going to be about story. And it's interesting how critical story and understanding our story is in helping our hearts and our minds and our spirits move freely into the future. And so those are the 2 months that I have sort of planned out already. And I just want to let you know, if you find these times helpful, then please go ahead and make comments. Let me know if it's helpful, how it's helpful, what was helpful about it. Feel free to share or like, because all of that data is stuff that I use to sort out whether this offering is helpful to others. So we're going to start in today right now, just because we've got a lot to cover. Like I mentioned, this might be more in the 20-minute range than normally we're in the 10 to 15-minute range. So when we are looking at this big topic, we know that today we're just going to basically scratch the surface. We're looking at freedom from addiction. And to arrive at freedom, we need to grow in our awareness of freedom. And as we find our awareness of addiction growing, we'll find some pathways that will lead more towards freedom. So we're going to explore addiction and how addiction develops. And I want you to think about this. We're going to use an extreme example, one that's very, very clear, and then we're going to talk about how lots of other things fit in this same example. So let's say for a minute that I am walking through life and there is some kind of disruption. That disruption can be shame, embarrassment, angst, hurt, frustration. It can be all kinds of things. There's disruption, and that disruption is really challenging for me to navigate. I do the best I can, but it feels like it's going to be overwhelming. And somebody comes along and says, hey, you don't have to feel that. You can feel euphoria. All you have to do is use needle. Okay, so we're using an extreme example. Let's call it some kind of needle-oriented drug, heroin or something. Now, I am going to, as a normal person, say, no, I'm not a drug addict. I'm not interested in that. I'm just going to deal with this disruption and keep moving. And I do that until one time when it's like extra big and it's too big for me, feels like it's too big for me to handle. And so since it's too big for me to handle, I say, oh, what the heck, let me try it. And so I try needle and I experience euphoria. And so euphoria is amazing. This sets me free from all of that disruption that was there, and it feels good, and I like that. And then I come back down to reality, and reality might end up with some pieces of disruption like shame or regret or whatever, but it's better than that was because some of this has been medicated. And then I go through life, and I keep going through life until another time happens when I'm disrupted. Okay, so everything that we've talked about so far is not addiction. Okay, that would be use or medicating that disruption. However, then that next time comes and I'm dealing with, internally I'm dealing with significant disruption. As I'm dealing with that disruption, my brain says, I don't have to deal with this. I know a different path. I can use needle and I will feel euphoria. And euphoria is way better than disruption. And so there's this pull towards needle, and there's a link between needle and euphoria. And so euphoria is the feeling state that my goal is, and whatever needle is happens to be my means of accomplishing that feeling state. So that's the cycle, and that's when addiction starts. And it goes in this cycle, and it keeps on going and going. It doesn't slow down or stop all by itself. So we're going to take a look at some of those points along that cycle and unpack them a little bit more, okay? So first off, we want to notice that there are what we could call, let's look at that space that we're looking at, needle. Okay, so, and obviously lots of people that are watching and lots of people in life are not heroin users or abusers, and they don't use a needle in their addiction, but there are addictive things that are going on. So let's talk about two different categories of addiction. We could call them sort of the acceptable addictions and the unacceptable addictions. Okay, so the unacceptable addictions are, of course, things that may violate morals or are especially destructive to myself or to people around me. And those include alcohol, drugs, sex, pornography, gambling, all of those things that would fit in those less acceptable. And when we talk about addicts, lots of times we're thinking about, in our brains, we're thinking about those kinds of things. The reality is there are also lots of acceptable addictions. So shopping, food, exercise, video games, social media, Netflix, reading, all of those, even working, ministry, all of those can be things that I go to instead of needle to feel different, an elevated sense of something that is a different feeling state. And so I want to recognize that whatever I end up using to medicate my disruption, and I begin to use that consistently so that I feel something different, this can be an addictive cycle. And that thing that I'm feeling up here in euphoria might not just be euphoric. It could be other things. It could be excitement. It could be connection. It could be a sense of control or importance. All of those are different feeling states instead of euphoria, but I might need that, and I want that instead of feeling this disruption that I'm feeling. That disruption can be boredom. That disruption can be loneliness. That disruption can be shame. It can be uncertainty. It can be fear. All of those things, I want to squish that down and feel something different. And so I use something to get to that additional feeling state, and that feels really, really good. So as I'm navigating this cycle, I move from disruption. My brain says, I want to feel that feeling state, and I know how to get there. All I have to do is this. It's really, really, I can do it all the time. I can trust it. It's trustworthy. Every time I do this, I feel that. And then eventually I come down. So let's take a look from a neurobiological realm of what's happening. There are all kinds of things. If I am feeling disruption, there are all kinds of things that I can do to navigate and process and help that disruption feel better. I can connect with somebody and talk it out. I can journal it. I can pray about it. I can go for a run. There's all kinds of healthy things I can do to process that disruption. Lots of times we do those things. Sometimes we don't, and we move into something that is this cycle that it has addictive qualities to it. When I'm in that addictive quality, before we get there, when I, let's say, have a great meal, dopamine is released in my brain and it makes me feel better. It reduces down some of the disruption. When I talk with a friend, feel connected, dopamine is released in my brain. It helps me feel better, and it reduces down some of that anxiety or whatever the other disruption is. When I exercise, when I do any of these things that are healthy ways to process, dopamine is released in my brain, and it feels good. Dopamine is that feel-good hormone. One of the challenges with addictive things, especially with substance abuse, but it's also true with others, is that there is an inhibition of a particular thing, and that thing changes this euphoric experience of dopamine. So for instance, with heroin use, if I am feeling disruption, I use needle, euphoria happens, dopamine is excreted in my brain, and something called GABA is released is not released, which is normally released. So GABA is gamma aminobutyric acid, and one of the uses of GABA is grabbing a hold of extra dopamine that is floating around and absorbing it. So normally I have a great meal and there's that dopamine release and I'm feeling good, and then in time it kind of drifts back, is absorbed, and that's healthy and we experience life in those gentle ways. What happens with significant use is that GABA no longer is released, and so the dopamine just stays there, and that feels really good, like it's a prolonged flood. There's a flood of dopamine and then it stays, and that feels so good, and I want that, and it makes me feel so good for so long, and it starts my brain thinking, this is what I want to feel all the time. Now, that can be because I've watched Netflix until all of the disruption is forgotten and gone, and I'm engaged in whatever the story is. It can be because I'm on social media tagging things and being excited about other people's story and putting my own up and those kinds of things. And so I can actually put myself in that state of continual dopamine release, which is very similar to that drug use that takes the GABA away and keeps that flood of dopamine going. And so hopefully that makes sense to you, that a piece of what happens on a neurobiological level is a shift in how our brain normally processes dopamine release and reabsorption, changes it so that this feeling state lingers longer, and it is tantalizing out there and sort of invites, like, you could feel this all the time. So then I come back down and I'm in that place of normal reality, and that normal reality might include a number of things. I might feel shame about that use, or I might not, depending on what it was. And as life goes on, different things happen and I feel disruption. And some of that disruption might include shame, loneliness, all of the kind of insecurity, all of the kinds of things that were there before. And it's a little bit ramped up because of whatever disruption was left from coming down, including I'm not feeling that, an awareness inside of me that I know what that is, I know what that feels like, and I'm not feeling that, and that adds to disruption, and it makes it more likely for me to use again so that I can feel that again. Okay, does that make sense? And so there's this drive that happens, and the cycle moves around more and more. Okay, so when we think about all of those pieces, it's helpful to recognize that when we use something and we feel that good feeling state, there is something called operant conditioning. And that is that if I do something and I receive a reward, I end up being more likely to do that thing again. And that's true pretty much across the board in life. And in addiction use, operant conditioning definitely functions as well. So notice that we're looking at, through a few different lenses, at addiction. We're looking at medicating this disruption. That's one goal that we have, whether we would call it that or not. I'm feeling these things, even if it's bored or lonely, and I don't want to feel this. And so then, since I don't want to feel this, I do something to medicate it, and whatever that something is reinforced to get me to this feeling state. And there's this link between, for instance, needle and this feeling state, or Netflix, chocolate, workaholism, and this feeling state. And that link is called compulsion. It's that place when I start feeling this, I start being pulled not to just medicate this, but specifically to medicate it by using this thing. And then I feel better for a little bit, and it drops down into reality, and reality is a little bit more angsty, a little bit more frustrating, a little bit more lonely or shameful than it was before, and so it's quicker for me to get to that overall disrupted place. Okay, so one of the things that we should ask is, what drives addiction? And one of the things that it's helpful for us to recognize is that something called adverse childhood experiences is one of the things that research says drives most addiction. So adverse childhood experiences, they call it ACE, A-C-E. There's a whole set of research that has gone into this, and they have it very clearly tied to most who are dealing with kinds of addictions that are disruptive have unrecognized adverse childhood experiences that have, because they've been unrecognized, they haven't been dealt with, they haven't been healed. And so some of those categories include, as a child, that includes age 0 to 17. So in that whole age range, experiencing violence, abuse, neglect, witnessing violence in the home or in the community, having a family member attempt suicide or die from suicide, and environmental factors that undermine my sense of safety and security, which can include watching somebody who is involved in substance abuse or addiction, somebody in my family who is dealing with mental health problems, and also instability due to parental separation, a household member being placed in jail or prison. Any of those things that are disruptive and erode my sense of safety and stability are qualifiers for what they call adverse childhood experiences. 61% of adults surveyed over 25 states have said that they have experienced at least one of those categories of adverse childhood experiences, and 1 in 6 said that they've experienced at least 4. And so the more of those kinds of experiences we've gone through, our heart has experienced, the more likely we have this disruption that is underlying, and the more likely I'm looking for something to feel better, and that this feel better becomes more and more important to me, and so it drives that addiction. So it's helpful to kind of recognize that for most people, they don't choose addiction, they're sort of driven to it, and much of what drives them to it is this unresolved pain from experiences that were beyond their control as they were growing up. And so we could take a look, and maybe there's that question, am I dealing with addiction, or am I just dealing with use or abuse? And my use of wine or alcohol or Netflix or whatever it is really not that bad, right? And so here's some of the things that we look at when we're talking about addiction, the major characteristics. Okay, so one of them is, I know this is sort of driving and I'm trying to sort of stop it, but I'm unsuccessful. I've had unsuccessful quitting attempts. I've tried to stop and I've not been able to. A second one is what they call cue-triggered relapse. I actually do stop, and I stop until this one thing happens that's like a trigger. It's a cue. Every time I'm overlooked at work for a promotion, something spikes in me, and I have to, it triggers this cycle again. Also, this sense of loss of control. This is that place where it says, oh, come on, I'm an adult. I can handle a glass of alcohol, whatever that might be. And so I have one, and then since I've had one, obviously I've handled that one, so I can have two. And then there's that place, wherever it is, that I'm not in control anymore. I actually can't stop. I keep on going and going. So that loss of control. In time, what happens is the dopamine release that happens up here is reduced, that flood doesn't have the same effect that it used to, and so I actually end up with the desire to have to feel that, but without the pleasure. And so there's a reduction in how pleasurable I feel when I use. There's also something called cross addiction. That's when I've decided, alcohol's a problem for me, so I'm not going to drink. I'm going to go for 90 days without drinking anything, which is really healthy and helpful, and that helps break free. But what happens then is, instead of alcohol, I go to something else. Okay, I go to Netflix, or I go to pornography, or something that helps me find a different feeling state, or something, or one that's really close to the same, but I'm not dealing with the alcohol anymore. So cross addictions. And there is a reality of genetic vulnerabilities. In my family of origin, places along the way, alcohol addiction has been a real issue, and so as a result, I know that I have a genetic predisposition towards addiction, and my kids will. And so we need to be especially vigilant and aware of those things and recognize these cycles when they're happening and find ways to break out. So we have a multifaceted issue. The reason I wanted to look at all those different places to look at addiction is that we recognize we can't just say, do this and you'll be cured of alcoholism. It needs to be addressed on a number of different levels, including how do I grow in my ability to navigate normal disruption in life. If I grow in that, then I'm going to be less pulled to try to get away from that. How do I release this tie between use and that feeling state? How do I begin to navigate the reality that there's a habit of this, and that any habit is difficult, but when it's a habit driven by dopamine addiction, so to speak, then that makes it even harder. And so dependency, isolation, shame, compulsion, medication, habit, all of those are lenses that we need to take a look at when we're trying to deal with overcoming addiction. And so addiction is not something that anybody that I know of has really been able to successfully treat on their own. It's an isolating kind of reality, and because of that, there is shame in it, and because of that, there is this message inside us that says, oh, I can do this by myself. And the reality is, I don't see that. And so if you or somebody that you know seems to fit in this description that we're talking about, I would just invite conversation with them. So feel free to ask them those questions and notice that there's this pattern that you see in their lives, or talk to somebody about patterns that you see in your life. And if you're in a church community, talk to somebody in your church community. Find a qualified mental health counselor or a group that is a recovery group, and pursue those things, because this is going to be very, very challenging to tackle alone. I want to close with this one thought, and that is that my professor at RTS who taught the addictions class, her name is Sharon Hirsch. She wrote a book that is called The Last Addiction, and it's a really great book talking about different aspects of addiction, and she does some case studies and talks about her own battle with addiction and then others, and some pathways towards freedom. And one of the things that's very, very interesting in what she said is that we all think that we're dealing okay with stuff. But let me read this little quote to you. This is from her book, and then she's also quoting somebody else. She says, "I hope to stretch your thinking about addiction. The truth is that no one escapes the reality of compulsion. Everyone loves something too much. Everyone struggles with passion gone awry. That's why we're all buying all those books. If you believe you don't struggle with addiction, you're probably more addicted than I am," she says. In his wonderful book, Addiction and Grace, Gerald May wrote, "It is as if these severely addicted people have played out on an extreme scale, a drama that all human beings experience more subtly and more covertly." And so Sharon goes on to say, "We all suffer from the same condition. We all seek a resting place from striving and suffering, and we often cling to what promises to be a haven, only to find out that what we have created is our own type of hell. I hope this book will deepen your compassion and commitment to yourself and to others, all those who are in bondage to something gone wrong." And so I want to invite us all into that reality that I might feel like all these things that Steve just talked about, they don't really apply to me. And I'm not judging or saying yes they do, but I want to invite us into that reality. When she boils it down, Sharon Hirsch says, okay, the last addiction really for all of us is that I have become addicted to me. to what I want and how I see things and how I can feel good. And so she invites us then to recognize that addiction to me has only one solution, and that solution is the Lord. Inviting us into a path of connection with Him that can allow us to break free from shame, to allow us to interact with others to get help, to allow us to really make a difference in our own heart's freedom. And so that's my hope and prayer for all of us, is that we wrestle with the last addiction so that we can understand and deal with these other besetting things that we all can tend to be pulled towards. So have a great day. Looking forward to this next month as we talk about angst in August. And my prayer for you is that you go through the rest of this week feeling more freedom than ever.